Believe it or not, I'm not going to be preaching a sermon on that excerpt from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Thank you, Lawrence. But I'm drawn both to the way that Nathanael encountered God in the gospel and the two people in this excerpt from the first book of Samuel. And I think each of them speaks to different ways that we have spoken to or not spoken to God over the course of our lives. And I think everyone in this room can share in these three moments. I think there's sometimes, especially perhaps as children, where we heard God very clearly, and there may have not been a lot of people around us, or perhaps anyone who heard the same thing that we did. And that continues to happen to us, I think. We'll have some sacred moments in our lives where God speaks to us and no one knows what we're talking about. I think just as often we could be like Eli, who genuinely had lost the ability to hear the voice of God. And it's a fearful thing for that to happen, and Eli seemed to really have no idea. And however horrible the news was that Samuel brought, he welcomed knowledge of what the mind of God told him. And then we have Nathanael, who had a very powerful encounter with the sacred, but it made no sense to anyone but Nathanael. I admit that sometimes that can be the case with me describing my call story. I read this really hilarious article by a priest, and he was talking about how disappointing his call story is to people who ask, because he says it just kind of came out of nowhere. And I mean, I could sum it up by saying I was at music camp or band camp, and I got lonely, and suddenly I felt absolutely called to become a priest in God's church. It's not a very satisfying story, but it made perfect sense to me. Just as Nathanael, well, you saw me, you predicted that I would be under a fig tree, here I am, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. So I was thinking a lot about these different ways that we encounter God, and I was honestly thinking about obstacles that sometimes might put me in the place of Eli. And I came across this really interesting article, and it was the content that I was mentioning to our young people. Apparently scientists, some social scientists are now suggesting that we have really only 4 emotions, and all of our many emotions come out of those 4: happiness and sadness, fear and anger. And there's something fascinating about what those emotions do to us, especially in light of our experiences in church. I'm going to offer this to you because I don't know if this is entirely true, and I think our young people didn't necessarily agree with me, which I think was kind of wonderful. It seems to me that when we are in a place of deep happiness or deep sadness, we love being around other people, people that we love, people in community. If you think of both weddings and funerals, they both make sense to us emotionally. The deepest happiness we can experience and the deepest sadness that we can experience. Sometimes, or most of the time, it feels fantastic to be surrounded by the people that we love. And we invite them to be with us in those times. And there can be a kind of joy in both of those times. Joy from deep happiness and a joy from deep sadness. But then there's those other two emotions, those two feelings of fear and anger. And it seems in those times we seem to do the opposite. And we tend to drive ourselves away when we're especially fearful from the people that we love, and drive ourselves away from those when we get really angry. It was fascinating, because this has been the case forever. It was fascinating that our young people didn't agree with me. When I get afraid, I hug my mom. That's a fantastic instinct. When I get angry, I tell somebody. Those are healthy responses. I don't know if we do that as much as adults. Perhaps we're afraid of looking weak. I'm not quite sure what the motivation is. Maybe we're afraid that we might hurt somebody. or it's embarrassing to look afraid, but it seems to be that when we encounter those two emotions, we tend to flee from the people that we love. I've been doing this kind of ministry in different ways for about 10 years now, and over again, that is a common account. I won't see someone for a few months sometimes, or a few weeks, and they'll return and say, I'm sorry I was away. I was very upset. I was very anxious. I was fearful. I was feeling very angry. And I couldn't be around those people in church. But I'm back now because I feel better. It seems to be such a common account that we share together. But there's something profound that happens to us, I think, in those moments if we allow it, if we have been prepared for it. And that is that we often, when we isolate ourselves, for better or for worse, the one presence that we often have is God. And there seems to be a powerful responsibility in church in those times when we are filled with deep happiness or deep sadness or whatever it is that calls us to be together, to build those relationships, to build those patterns, to feed from those rituals, because there will come a time when we are alone. We're either alone because of our circumstances, we're alone because of health, because we're deeply afraid, because we're deeply angry, or perhaps those emotions come out of isolation. And the relationships that we have fostered will result in people trying to give us a hug, asking us if we want food. That happens a lot. And it'll also deepen our faith in God. I couldn't resist telling this story at our previous service. That call story, that on the surface is rather silly, because it was so short and the circumstances were so non-dramatic. But when I was alone in this music camp, it was the first moment really of my youth where I felt completely and utterly alone. And like many of our 20-somethings, I was for the first time undergoing a massive career shift in my mind. A lot of people in their 20s, they have to switch careers, switch identities almost overnight, right? You go into a degree program and you find out 2 years in, I hate doing this. I don't ever want to do this again. I have to change my sense of self, where I'm going to go. I've broken up with a long-term relationship. I have no idea what my future is. Right? These things happen a lot. And I had one of those big shifts. I don't think I want to be a professional French horn player. And it changed every sense of what my future was going to be. It changed my identity. It changed everything. And in that moment, I really, in a lot of ways, felt like I had nothing. It was this camp in northern Quebec somewhere where they send musicians. Domaine Forget. It's a fantastic place. But I couldn't play my French horn. All the stress had caused me to basically be physically unable to play. I didn't have my music. I didn't have my friends. I didn't have a community that was based around music. If you're around musicians and you don't play music, there's not much to do. I was away from my family, and I was utterly and completely alone and terrified. And in that moment, I invited God to join me in the darkness, and I was filled with joy. And my circumstances did not change, but everything changed. And like Nathaniel, I'm like, that's it. I'm going to be an Anglican priest. And I got back home and I told people this fantastic story, I thought, and everyone had this look of bewilderment. But you left, you're doing a music degree. Is this because of your dad? No. So we have these moments, but reflecting upon it, I was prepared, like I think we are all preparing ourselves, week after week after week, being in church. I was a priest's kid, and I honestly thought for a long chunk there that these rituals didn't have any power, that these same stories I heard over and over again didn't have any power. And in that moment, alone in the dark, my life was transformed. I was prepared by my church to be alone with God. And I feel like that's what we're doing. In a lot of ways, a lot of these Sundays, we're preparing for that time one day when we'll be alone with God. And it can be a time of deep fear and deep anger, or it can be a holy time, a sacred time filled with joy